Welcome to the fourth Exploring Research seminar in our spring programme, the Entangled Histories of LGBTQI+ Lives in Britain. Thanks for joining us live today. My name is Angela Saywood. I'm a Research Development Specialist here at Wellcome Collection. My background is in moving image and sound. For those of you who cannot see the screen, I have loose, curly silver hair. I'm wearing dark frame glasses and silver and blue coloured earrings and a mid-blue blouse with white stripes. I have a plain background and my pronouns are she and her. As the title of the series suggests, these seminars explore current research that relates to our collections around topics that touch on how we think and feel about health. In the spring programme, we focus on material post-1800. For previous seminars we have delivered in the programme, please see the Wellcome Collection events page on our website. A link can be seen in the chat. Our autumn programme will feature speakers that cover material from medieval and early modern periods. More details about this will be advertised throughout our research networks in due course. So now to introduce our speaker today, David Griffiths. David's PhD in Critical and Cultural Theory at the English Department, Cardiff University, covered queer ecologies, ecofeminism and transhumanism. David is currently based in the Department of Sociology at Surrey University, writing a social and medical history on intersex in Britain from the early 20th century, working closely with colleagues in psychology. David's research interests are varied, looking at sex, gender and sexuality, as well as interdisciplinary, queer theory and feminist science studies, placing medical and scientific conceptions of non-normative bodies and practices in their historical and cultural context. I first encountered David in February 2020 at another Exploring Research event, when we were able to host these at Wellcome Collection. This featured the research of one of David's colleagues at Surrey, Dr Catherine Hubbard, on the queer world of Margaret Lowenfelt. David and Catherine have co-published their research revealing positive but precarious LGBTQI+ histories. During the talk, we are excited to be able to preview some newly digitised video material from the archives of Dr Dave King. Just before we start, please be aware that the talk may contain adult content and associated language. Wishing to give no further spoilers, we are delighted to welcome Dr. David Griffiths. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angela, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me in the first place. My name is Dr. David Griffiths. I use he, him pronouns. And for a visual description for you, I've got quite plain white background. I'm a cis white man in my 30s and I have light brown hair and a moustache and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt. So yeah, thank you to Angela. Like Angela just said, we met and she invited me to give this talk more than a year ago at my friend and colleague Dr. Catherine Hubbard's amazing talk at the Wellcome Building, and it's a shame I can't be at the Wellcome Building today because so much has changed since February 2020. But thank you not just to Angela, but to all the people that you can't see who are behind the scenes making this happen in a kind of technical way that I can't even pretend to understand. So thank you to everyone at the Wellcome for keeping this fascinating series of events going. I've just actually completed a Wellcome Trust Fellowship at the University of Surrey. Like Angela says, I'm writing a recent and contemporary history of intersex in Britain. As Angela said, I'm in a sociology department writing history, but previous to that, I got my PhD from an English department in critical and cultural theory. So I'm very much approaching my work as an interdisciplinary project. So for the last 5 years, I've been working on a recent and contemporary history of intersex in Britain. I look at medical archives, intersex activism and scholarship, media articles, and I try to bring different academic disciplines such as feminist science studies, queer theory, cultural studies of health and medicine, bring them to bear on this complex field. Intersex is interdisciplinary as far as I'm concerned. It emerges from medicine, but it's based on historically and culturally specific notions of the body, of sex, gender, and sexuality. So it demands an interdisciplinary response. So I'm going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I can't see the slides, but I'm assured that there we go, the slides are up. Thank you. This is what I mean about brilliant technical people behind the scenes that we can't see making this happen. So if we could go to the next slide, I will tell you what I'm going to talk about for the next kind of 30 to 40 minutes. First of all, I'm going to give a little intro to intersex. Some of you here might know more than others, but I thought it's a good place to start, so we all kind of start from the same starting point. Then, secondly, I'm going to turn to the question of where is intersex in the kind of historical archive, particularly in the kinds of archives that are at the Wellcome Library. I'm going to talk about my work and some of the ways that I find resources, narratives, and the kind of documents that I work on. I'm then going to talk about a very specific example of Georgina Somerset, and this is the point where I'll get to show a really fascinating little clip, which, as Angela said, has just very recently been digitized. Great. To conclude, I'm going to draw a little bit on some of that archival historical work that I've done and just do a little bit of theoretical work just to give you, say, a taste of the kind of work that I do and how I use archival work, historical work, comment on contemporary issues and contemporary questions. I'm specifically going to be thinking about this acronym, about LGBTQI+, and some of the questions that groups and institutions and individuals are debating about the addition of I to LGBTQI+. So to start off with our intro to intersex, we can begin with kind of a working definition that intersex is when an individual is born with biological sex characteristics that don't neatly fit our cultural norms of solely male or female. So when I say biological sex characteristics, that's a deliberate choice following intersex activists in not saying biological sex in the singular, but saying biological sex characteristics in the plural. And as you can see on the slides, we've got a list here, and probably not an exhaustive list, but we can go through this quickly to think about the different kinds of biological sex characteristics we kind of think about when we think about sex. So to start off with, we have the so-called sex chromosomes. We assume, individuals we assume are boys and men have XY chromosomes and girls and women have XX. Like I say, this is an assumption. I personally have no knowledge of my sex chromosomes, my karyotype. Also, humans, generally speaking, have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and there are genetic markers that can be associated with sex development on chromosomes other than the X and Y. So that's why second on the list, we have genetic characteristics. Coming to the third on the list, we have the gonads, where we assume, again, making lots of assumptions, we assume individuals that we assume are male have 2 testes, and individuals we assume are female, we assume have 2 ovaries. Related to those gonads, we can move on to the fourth on the list, which is the hormones. Often in kind of common parlance, in kind of media articles, things like that, testosterone and estrogen are often called male and female sex hormones. However, they're more complicated than this. They're involved in more than just sex development, and it's not the case that men just have testosterone and women just have estrogen. Then we move to genitals on the list, and again and we assume that it's penis for boys, vagina for girls. And then at the end of this list of 6, we have the secondary sex characteristics, a very big kind of catch-all term, which includes things like breasts, so-called male pattern baldness, fat muscle ratios, body hair distribution, etc. We might want to add psychological sex or brain sex, all those kind of things, but that's a very contested area, as is everything in this field. And the line between biological and psychological is obviously blurry. There's a lot of friction, a lot of tension, a lot of boundary work that goes on to maintain distinctions between the biological and the psychological. And that is kind of a subject for another talk, but it is one that I will come back to slightly later on. So when I say that intersex is when individuals have biological sex characteristics that don't line up neatly as our cultural understandings of solely male or female, you can see that it can be kind of within or across any of these biological sex characteristics. You may have heard of older terms such as hermaphrodite, which is considered inaccurate and offensive, or you may even have heard of kind of newer terms doctors are increasingly using, such as disorders of sex development, or DSD. We can go to the next slide. We can see that DSD, that's disorders of sex development, were defined in 2005 as congenital conditions in which development of chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical sex is atypical. This shift from the terminology of intersex and the terminology of hermaphrodite happened in 2005 at a medical conference in Chicago, and the following year in 2006 there was the publication of the so-called consensus statement, which signaled a kind of shift towards this language of DSD, that is disorders of sex development. It might come as no surprise that many intersex activists are not keen on naming what are mostly benign bodily variations as disorders, and indeed research has shown that by framing intersex variations as medical disorders, individuals are more likely to support early childhood genital surgeries and interventions. And if these early childhood surgeries on the genitals are unneeded, if they are on mostly benign bodily variations, then they are cosmetic interventions. Of course, when they are performed on an infant's body, they are, of course, non-consensual. And these kind of ongoing surgical interventions have been defined by international bodies such as the UN as human rights abuses, within the same language even as torture. So for activists, it is clear why you might want to fight the definition of benign bodily variations as disorders. So if we go to the next slide, I think this is what the content warning was about at the start, was a quote from an intersex activist quoted in Georgina Davis's fantastic Contesting Intersex book, saying that DSD is not something a lot of people want to identify with, because nobody wants to be a disorder. Who wants to be a fucking disorder? I don't. And this really sums up the kind of anger that you will find in a lot of intersex activist communities about this framing of bodily variations as disorders. It is important to remember that intersex and DSD and the more recent VSC, which stands for variations in sex characteristics that has been suggested, that these are all umbrella terms. And it's not always entirely clear who gets to shelter under which umbrella. You may have heard of specific diagnoses like Klinefelter syndrome or congenital adrenal hyperplasia, androgen insensitivity syndrome, Turner syndrome, hyperspadias. These are all individual diagnoses that might or might not get included under an umbrella of intersex or DSD or VSC. Might be included, might be not, might get classified in, might not get classified in. So this is all quite tricky boundary work that goes on, all within that kind of what we might kind of try and define as intersex. Not only this, but these individual diagnoses which might seem more clear to us than these umbrella terms when it's not entirely clear who fits under which umbrella, they're historically contingent too. So certain descriptions of syndromes come along at certain times and then they change over time. Which brings me to a very pertinent question for my kind of research, which is, when everything's so complex, when all the definitions are really complex, when the definitions shift, the umbrella terms change, it's not clear who's in and who's out, which variations in, which variations out, how on earth do you find resources on this to do any kind of historical research? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So yeah, this is the kind of question that I'm asking, is where is intersex in the archive? How do you find it? How do you go about searching the archive, searching something like the Wellcome Library for this? So to give a little example, the contemporary diagnostic category of congenital adrenal hyperplasia somewhat resembles a previous diagnostic category called the adrenogenital syndrome. Through this route and others, I found that there was a British surgeon who was apparently an expert in the functioning and surgical removal of the adrenal gland working in Britain in the 30s. And on the next slide, I've got a few of his publications. So this is Lennox Ross Broster, born in 1889, died in 1965. In the Wellcome archives, in the Wellcome Library, there are some of his published works, including 1933's The Adrenal Cortex, a Surgical and Pathological Study, 1938's The Adrenal Cortex and Intersexuality, and 1944's Endocrine Man, a Study in the Surgery of Sex. Broster was incredibly busy in the 30s doing this kind of work. And his work at Charing Cross Hospital was set up Charing Cross Hospital as a centre for this kind of work in the 30s before the war. Broster's focus was on physical variations that he considered derived from some kind of abnormality, in inverted commas, in the adrenal gland. These physical differences or variations included possibly larger than average clitoris, labia that could resemble scrotum, and other differences in distribution of body fat and hair. The 1933 publication, The Adrenal Cortex, a Surgical and Pathological Study, presents 10 case studies. The 1938 book presents many, many more, and in that book he claims to have seen over 100 patients. His approach was surgical removal of part or all of the adrenal gland. This is important history, as generally speaking, if you go looking to read intersex history, you will find talk of John Money in the 1950s in the US. But here we have a chapter of intersex history, a distinctly British history of surgical intervention to normalize the bodies of those considered non-normative in terms of their sex, but also in terms of their gender and or sexuality. Because, like I said about that boundary work between biological and psychological, Broster did not actually confine his research really even to what was called at the time the adrenogenital syndrome, but also he didn't confine his research to the biological. He worked closely with the psychiatrist Clifford Allen. You can see him as the second co-author of the 1938 book, and he had a chapter in there on psychology. And Lennox Ross Broster himself, we go to the next slide, please, said that, there we go, perhaps the most interesting, disquieting, and to the clinician the most perplexing feature of these patients is their psychological outlook. For Broster, adrenalectomy, so surgical removal of part or increasingly all of the adrenal gland, he thought was an efficient tool for normalizing in inverted commas, both biology and psychology. He claimed not only did it fix biological characteristics, but also he thought it went some way to normalize gender non-normativity and homosexuality. However, between Broster and Allen, they very much thought that these kind of surgical interventions should be reserved for individuals with identifiable physical variations from the norm, what they called abnormalities. Despite this, individuals that we might now call trans do haunt this particular archive. There's a fascinating mention in this 1938 book of someone coming to Broster, presenting as a woman, asking to become a man so that she could marry her girlfriend, or they could marry their girlfriend. Hard to know what pronouns to use in this case. Broster and Allen use she and her. They found no physical abnormality, so Broster refused to treat this individual, passed them to Allen, and Allen offered psychotherapy to try and cure the apparent homosexuality. But what happens then is this individual refuses this treatment and leaves, disappears from the book, disappears from the archive, disappears from the history. It's an interesting moment where an individual is hard to categorize, hard to classify, and in a way sort of evades the control of this particular moment in the archive. Lots of this, the Broster publications and other work from and on Broster, is in the Dave King archive in the Wellcome Library. Dave King was kind of preeminent trans scholar and gave an amazing archive to the Wellcome Library, and 12 when that happened. It's an incredible historical archive, vast amounts of stuff in there. But as you can tell, it's a trans history archive. But as you see from my discussion of Broster and Allen, what we're looking at here is a moment where the distinction between sex and gender and sexuality was really blurry, and thus the distinction between intersex, trans, and homosexuality were not distinct in the way we might expect them to be today. So, researching intersex treatments, intersex lives, and experiences in the past, often I have to go searching for these moments, searching for older diagnostic categories, but also kind of reading through archives like the Dave King archive, Trans History Archive, but looking for kind of interesting moments where an individual is harder to classify, try to hear kind of interesting voices in the medical texts, but also kind of try to read these archives against themselves, kind of against the grain, to try and find kind of what's sometimes written between the lines. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to move on from the 30s, the 1960s, and I'm going to tell you about Georgina Somerset. Georgina was born in 1923, assigned male, and she lived as a man up until 1957, at which point she underwent a medical procedure and re-registered as female. During this time, the late 50s, early 60s, the British media, as elsewhere, were fascinated by what they were calling at the time sex change. They'd reported extensively on Christine Jorgensen's international celebrity in the late 1950s. Somerset herself gained media attention from local and national newspapers in 1960. So she's really interesting. She's an interesting example of an individual, an early example of an intersex person, in fact, in Britain, trying to use the media to tell their own story. So a very early example on the next slide is from the News of the World, where over the course of 3 weeks, on the 17th, the 24th, and the 31st of July 1960, Somerset told her own story, although it's unclear to what extent exactly the series was truly in her own words. She was, however, keen, if we're thinking about kind of the entanglement of sex, gender, and sexuality and how they're really hard to kind of tease out in these histories, she's very, very keen to emphasize her heterosexuality throughout these pieces. She says, "I must stress that I have had no sex life in the normal sense. I occasionally took out a girl just because it was the accepted thing. But believe me, I did not know what to say or do. Even holding hands seemed unnatural. That was about as far as I ever got." I don't know, you're like me in the audience, but after a year of COVID and lockdowns, maybe holding hands actually seems quite racy. But the following week, on the 24th of July, she wrote again that following that first piece, that she actually received several proposals of marriage, and one eager suitor even made a personal call to propose. She says, "Let me say at once that marriage is included in my plans for the future if Mr. Right comes along." So here she's really kind of asserting heterosexuality in this dual move, assuring the reader that she had no kind of sexual activity with women when she was living as a man, and by projecting a heterosexual marriage with a man into the future, kind of confirming her gender through her heterosexuality, making the kind of the appropriateness of correcting the mistake on her birth certificate and the whole kind of re-registering her as a woman. As you can see from the picture on the slide, the spoiler alert that she did in fact meet Mr. Right, and Mr. Right came along. I don't know if he was one of those suitors who called her up or wrote a letter, but 2 years later in 1962, she married Mr. Somerset here, and she is in fact the first known person to marry in a Church of England church after having re-registered her sex. So next slide, please. So yeah, in 1966, she appeared on the BBC documentary programme Horizon in later interviews, one of which is conducted by Dave King, and the notes are in the archive. And also in her autobiography, she talks about it as well. She says she gave them lots of material and recorded loads of stuff, but it was heavily edited down, and she's actually only appears for a few minutes, a tantalizing few minutes. It's very interesting. But yeah, as Angela said at the start, this has very recently been digitized, which is great because I remember watching it in the Wellcome archive on an old VHS tape, which was quite exciting, but it's lovely to see it digitized. So there are just two very short clips, which one of the wonderful tech people is going to play, and then we'll come back and I'll discuss it a little bit more.
Well, I suppose first of all we must make an absolutely clear distinction between the intersex group, where there is an anatomical and physiological abnormality, some thing that you can see that the individual has been born with, and the purely psychological disorder, which we call transsexualism. A good many of the cases that reach the widespread publicity have in fact been transsexualists, individuals who are anatomically, and to every physical test that we can devise, normal in one sex or other, and yet believe themselves, become increasingly convinced that they properly belong to the other sex.
When these cases do make the headlines, they tend to cause amazement rather than sympathy, speculation rather than understanding. For it's difficult for the layman to grasp from this kind of reporting either the anatomical implications or the tremendous psychological somersault involved for those concerned. One of these cases, a qualified dentist, a mason, and for the first 37 years of his life, a man, served as a surgeon lieutenant in the Royal Navy and is one of the few transsexualists with the medical training and the emotional balance to be able to give both a personal and professional account of the transsexualist experience. His name was George Turtle. He changed it to Georgina Turtle and had his birth certificate altered after medical treatment and surgery. That was in 1960. 2 years later, Georgina Turtle was married to Christopher Somerset in a formal and fashionable ceremony at St. Margaret's, Westminster. Still happily married, she's just celebrated her 4th wedding anniversary. She published a book about transsexualism and was able to talk to Horizon from the unique position of someone with both medical training and personal understanding of the transsexual condition.
I find it always rather difficult to speak about my own case, because I always feel that I'm trying to justify myself, of course, and I've got past that stage now. I must say I did at one time feel that I had to put every little thing that I could think of to persuade somebody to help me.
How did you manage this?
Well, it is just that one presses. It's very difficult to say. You just go from place to place. And eventually I was able to receive the necessary surgery to enable me to take what I feel is my correct role in life. And I think if there's any real proof wanted of my correctness in my change now, I think it's here today.
So you managed to have surgery, and then what happened? Did you go on taking hormones?
Yes, I feel very much better on hormones. I sort of experimented with them.
What can they do?
Hormones will, of course, help the stimulation of secondary sexual characteristics. And if you give a man female hormones, you will prompt the development of the breasts. Muscles will become a little less powerful, shall we say, and a little bit more flabby. The individual will become more placid and generally sort of weaker in themselves. But of course their main bone structure remains exactly the same.
How far can surgery actually produce female anatomy?
Much less than the average person is led to believe. There is no question that anybody can actually change sex. You can assist them to change their role if their psychological state is such that it necessitates it. If in fact they can't live in any other way except, say, if a male can't live any other way than as a woman, then of course I think that rather than they just sort of hide away and eventually commit suicide, I think that the medical profession are right to help them.
That's great, thank you. So, a really interesting clip, very much of its time, and lots of the things are being said. But I think it's very interesting to think about it in terms of what I've been saying about these interesting historical moments where sex, gender, and sexuality are trying to get sorted out, but they're so conflated and so entangled that the documentary begins with a statement that we must make a distinction between what they call transsexualism and intersex. But then very shortly afterwards, this all falls apart, and throughout the documentary, individual diagnoses are described as types of transsexualism. Georgina Somerset is introduced as a transsexualist. And there are attempts throughout this documentary, really interesting attempts to both distinguish and link intersex and trans, intersex and homosexuality. It's really trying to disentangle those threads. I think just like in the news media articles that I shared the little quotes from, we have a bit of a kind of Georgina performing a normative heterosexuality, normative gender presentation as a way of kind of presenting her kind of correctness, as she says, and trying to sort of do a little bit of that distinguishing work, that disentangling of what is at this moment, and will go on to be an ongoing tension between the T and the I and the L, the G, the B, the T, the I of the acronym. To take us through to the end of the 1960s, in 1969, Georgina Somerset brought a libel case to court, specifically because she had been called a homosexual man, to be precise, in a medical journal. Fascinatingly, written by Clifford Allen, the psychiatrist who I was talking about in the 1930s. He wrote a piece in the medical journal Pulse, some copies of which are in the medical library, but this particular one not, so I had to go find that elsewhere, unfortunately. But yeah, he wrote this piece about her, she read it, she brought a libel case because this article claimed that she was homosexual and that her marriage was probably null and void. During the case, she had medical tests and discovered XYXO chromosome status. And she got an apology from Clifford Allen for writing that. So she won her libel case. So these moments, the kind of 1930s stuff that I've shown you, but also this kind of the 1960s moments, looking at Georgina Somerset, and there's quite a lot on her in the Dave King Archive, which is really great, including this newly digitized clip, which is brilliant. But they show at this historical moment just how difficult it is to separate out the strands of LGBTQI+. As we have historically tried to work out complications and difficulties around sex, gender, and sexuality, intersex has always been there, both as something to be explained and as an explanatory lens, which is called upon to do kind of explanatory work of non-normative gender or sexuality. So I think it would be a mistake if we look at the kind of tensions that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the final section, about whether or not to add the I to LGBTI. It would be a mistake to see these tensions as necessarily new. That intersex has always been there in these difficult discussions and boundary work between sex, gender, and sexuality. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to, in this last section, just do a little bit of kind of theory stuff to give a little bit of an example of how I use the kinds of archival resources and historical resources that I find in the Wellcome Library to comment on and to help with contemporary questions and contemporary discussions. I'm going to be talking about this question of, should we add the I to LGBTQI? And as you've seen from the historical resources that I've shown you, my argument is that it doesn't really make sense to ask the question, should we add the I, if we're saying that intersex has historically been there all along? And instead, we might need to ask what it means to recognize that it was there all along. So therefore, we move from a politics of addition to a politics of recognition. Go to the next slide, please. I'm not the first person to suggest that a politics of recognition might be a useful tool for thinking about, the injustices of intersex. In his 2005 analysis of Anne Fausto Sterling and Suzanne Kessler's early 80s, 90s work on intersex, Ian Morland argues that surgery for intersex marks a failure of recognition, both of intersex bodies and of intersexuality's social significance. So for Morland, the kinds of surgeries I was talking about earlier represent a double failure of recognition. The surgery fails to recognize that these are benign bodily variations that don't need intervention, but the surgeon also fails to recognize their own role as part of the social construction of sex and gender enacted upon the often infant body that can't consent. So in the face of this double failure of recognition, any kind of recognition of intersex might be what Morland calls a gesture towards social justice, because it's a recognition that the sexual is political. Recent scholarship too has suggested that not just the surgical moment, but the moment of diagnosis is one that's fraught with the challenges of recognition. Natalie Delamata, for example, argues that within this current model, the DSD model of pathologizing bodily difference under that kind of umbrella term of disorders, diagnosis might represent a failure of recognition, a moment of misrecognition, and one that she describes as a moment of disinterpolation. However, in my recent work thinking about Georgina Somerset, thinking about these little historical moments in the archive, I want to turn away from that kind of medical moment of recognition and think about recognition in a non-medical setting and what recognition might mean in LGBTQI+ politics. Because if the recognition of intersex is an act of social justice, as Morland suggests, or it might be a gesture towards it, as Morland suggests, then surely we can just add the I to our LGBT and we're done. We're LGBTI that's enough activism for today. But of course, that's clearly insufficient. Some intersex activists argue very strongly for we need to include the I on every LGBT, you need to work on inclusion, get the I on LGBT. Some intersex activists and scholars are more wary, argue against it, etc. But I think all of those people who are thinking about it have in common an awareness of the dangers of just simply adding an I, where intersex politics might get subsumed or erased within more mainstream L, G, B, or T politics, narratives, and demands. So we can go to the next slide. And I promise I'm not going to give you lots and lots of heavy philosophy, but it's just to show you how I try to connect archival resources with work and theory to comment on contemporary kind of issues. It might be useful to just briefly turn to the philosophy of recognition. So on the next slide, I have a quote from Paddy McQueen, who has argued that recognition might not always be positive. Recognition can function as a regulatory social practice, and he draws on Judith Butler to make what he calls a more kind of ambivalent approach to recognition. And if we think about it, the kind of so-called normalizing surgeries that we might want to argue against, that intersex activists argue against, we might actually understand them in a way as an attempt to make intersex bodies recognizable, but within particular kind of cultural and social constraints. So I think perhaps we might need this kind of more ambivalent account of recognition. On the next slide, we have one of the key thinkers in the philosophy of recognition, Charles Taylor. In his classic text, The Politics of Recognition, he's actually talking about multiculturalism, but I think this can maybe provide us with a useful way of thinking about an LGBTQI plus politics of recognition. The tension in both might be considered as a tension between, stealing from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's notion of the universalizing versus the minoritizing. We have a tension under the umbrella. We have the universalizing umbrella where we're all in this together, but we also have the minoritizing dedication to the honoring of difference. We're all different underneath the umbrella. Taylor suggests that a politics of recognition demands a working through of this tension, a thinking to what he calls the fusion of horizons. And I think there are kind of two key points that I'll bring out from his work. One is the need for what he calls new vocabularies through this kind of fusion of horizons. And the other is that a true politics of recognition is necessarily transformative. So in terms of LGBTQI plus politics, the danger is adding the I, but not developing new vocabularies and not being transformed in any real way. Go to the next slide, please. We can connect this to the intersex scholar and activist Morgan Carpenter's argument. In this paper and elsewhere, he has argued that the move from LGBT, LGBTI, and LGBTQI+, has not always included attention to the implications of this, and that the I gets subsumed within a focus on gender identities such as pronouns or toilets, sexual orientation issues such as sexual health. Carpenter says a framing of sexual orientation and gender identity is inadequate to address issues affecting intersex people, but has dangerously been perceived as adequate. It is necessary to move beyond matters of identification to consider how bodies are treated. Key to Taylor and McQueen's argument is that being recognized and being made recognizable are not the same. Another slide, please. So being made recognizable in Carpenter's argument for intersex people in LGBT politics often just becomes being asked to speak in the vocabulary of gender identity or sexual health, whereas a politics of recognition would be committed to the necessity of LGBT organizations truly transforming and building new vocabularies towards these kind of new horizons. And as I've been saying, the historical approach in looking at these archival documents reveals to us that this is not a new question, this is not a new tension, not a new friction. Rather, we can see in the Georgina Somerset interview in Horizon, and read the interview that she did with Dave King that's in the Dave King Archive and in her autobiography, that she felt unhappy with the way that she was presented. They edited it down. We can see now with kind of her modern eyes when we look at it that they say, oh, here's this variation, this diagnosis, this is a form of transsexualism. But we can see this perhaps as a moment of misrecognition where Georgina is being asked to speak in a vocabulary that doesn't actually represent her experience. And we might even look and think about those moments I talked about in the archive where an individual kind of defies classification and challenges us to think about how we do classification as moments that force us to think about how we recognize what's in the archive. So, to conclude, it's not a question of whether or not to add the I to the LGBTQI plus. As far as I can tell when I look at these kind of rich resources, these great archives, that intersex has been there all along, as I said earlier, as often something to be explained, but also being called upon to do the kind of conceptual explanatory work whenever it came to non-normative sex, gender and sexuality. But also it's not enough just try to make intersex recognizable within an existing system paradigm vocabulary of primarily LGBT-focused politics. As we can see with Morgan Carpenter's argument, as we can see with Georgina Somerset back in 1966, to truly recognize is not the same as to make recognizable. So rather, politics of recognition must ask how exactly LGBT politics must transform, looking back to these moments in history, but looking forward to these inclusive horizons, to ask what new vocabs, demands, structures, material changes are needed to truly recognize the I in LGBTQI. And that's my last slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That's absolutely fascinating. We've had quite a lot of questions, and some of them obviously are they are reacting or responding to the kind of some of the contentious and challenging issues that you've raised. So let's have a discussion about and go through some of those questions. And if we haven't got to your question, as I mentioned it before, we'll construct some answers to circulate after the event. So, I mean, I'm very interested in having looked at the video of Georgina Somerset and what the outcome for her was on her encounter with the media. And I think you touched on that a little bit. So is there anything else to share that you kind of, in terms of her story, that kind of gives her more agency to her history?
Yeah, so she continued to do engagement with the media. She didn't do this in 1966 and then give up. So she continued to appear on the BBC throughout her life, and she wrote to the BMJ, and she was medically trained. She was a dentist, so she had a kind of understanding of medical discourse and medical stuff. So she was constantly kind of trying to speak as herself and make herself recognizable in the way she wanted to be made recognizable. Of course, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do in the media. But yeah, she's a very interesting woman and quite fascinating. But yeah, she continued to kind of appear and speak for herself and try and maintain some of that agency.
Well, she certainly comes across with quite considerable dignity, although you did say that she was kind of very displeased how her account was kind of cropped and reduced to kind of just the comments that we can see in the archive. There is one question I'd like to start with, which wasn't one that came through nearer the end, but I thought it might be relevant. And it's a question around what was the most illuminating or surprising or illuminating thing you found in the Dave King Archive, and how did using the collection shape your research?
Oh yeah, great question. There are so many things. Like I say, it is a trans history archive, so you might not necessarily go there and think I'm going to find kind of stuff on intersex, but quite interesting because a lot of the time there'll be mention again like of individuals, of stories and things that maybe Dave King will be saying, okay, this isn't for my research. This is stuff that I found out. This isn't really about trans lives. This is about intersex. Puts it to one side, but it is there in that archive, and you can kind of find that in there. I would say probably that video that I found was probably the best moment, because that was fascinating to just see someone who I knew about, Georgina Somerset, I read about being, you know, an intersex person in Britain, and to see kind of her speaking for herself, even though it was only for a couple of minutes in 1966. And like you say, speaking with dignity and coming across very well and just speaking for herself in 1966 on the BBC, I found really, really fascinating. And in the experience of watching it, to see so many what we think of as very contemporary debates played out in that documentary space, talking about the Olympics and all sorts of things that we think about as being very contemporary debates, but they're happening and they're doing this in this documentary form. So yeah, okay, I would say that was the highlight.
Thank you. So there are some comments around the use of the term intersex, and I'll read out one of the more detailed comments that were shared with us. As stated in the 2018 paper of Lundberg, Hegarty and Rowan, over 50% of people living with variations of sex development either find the term intersex problematic or have not heard of the term, and only 10% of young people like or would use the term intersex to describe themselves. Is research using this terminology exclusionary of their lives and best interests?
That's a very good question. It's a difficult one. Like I say, we're dealing with umbrella terms here. The intersex is an umbrella term. DSD is an umbrella term. VSC, this more recent variations of sex characteristics, is an umbrella term. And they do different things in different spaces. That there is a lot of research out there that, you know, that suggests that using certain kinds of language has certain kinds of effects and will exclude some people and not others. I'm certainly not trying to be exclusionary when I talk about intersex, and I hope that comes across when I talk about the fact that these are umbrella terms that have been used at different times. And if I'm going looking for history in the archive, DSD is obviously, how 15 years old now, I suppose? Yes, I can't do my maths that quickly, but you'll find intersex, and before that terms like hermaphrodite that I wouldn't use in kind of common parlance, and that's not kind of a term that people generally want to associate themselves with. But that is the kind of language that you find in the archive, and you have to do a lot of kind of negotiating that, shifting language. But yeah, individuals in different times in their lives in different spaces will use different language, and that's absolutely correct, and everybody should have access to as much language as possible, use what terms they find help them gain the best life chances and access to what they want to access. So I hope that kind of answers it.
So I mean, another question around the term intersex, and a question around whether the term has contributed to an alarming claim that sex is not dimorphic, with some using the conditions as an example of a literal third sex.
Yeah, okay, so I think this might be an example of what I said about when you go looking in the archive for history, that not only is intersex or variations of sex characteristics, or however you want to phrase it, or individual diagnoses or variations, not only are they there as something non-normative, let's say, to be explained, but they are called upon to do a lot of conceptual work, to be used as an explanatory lens, or in this example, to do a lot of very big kind of metaphysical, philosophical discussions. And that's not something that I want to be really doing in my research, but I think it is interesting that this is happening through history, that intersex is always there. And at these historical moments when we are having big conversations about sex, about gender, about sexuality, and trying to distinguish them, but link them, put them under an umbrella, but keep them separate somehow. When we're having those big, difficult discussions, intersex is always there as something to be explained, but also is given a lot of this kind of, is given a lot of work to do, conceptual work to do as a kind of explanatory lens. So I think that is kind of interesting.
And a question that kind of is aligned with that is kind of what is the rationale behind the inclusion of intersex, which is a broad medical, an umbrella kind of term, with LGBT, and which are focused on sexual orientation, and the T on gender identity. Is this helpful?
Yes. So, like I said in the talk, quite a lot of intersex activist groups, organisations argue very vociferously for adding that I on and including that I. And there are groups and organisations and individuals who argue very strongly against it. There are, like I said in the presentation, there are dangers of it getting lost and particular demands getting subsumed or erased. But some of the arguments for including it, there are very, very practical arguments that say LGBT groups have more resources. So if we want to do work, we need to kind of get those resources in some way. There are arguments around stigma, around prejudice, things like that, that will be understood within groups of non-normative sexuality and gender, that when that's applied to non-normative biological sex characteristics, that kind of rings true. There's research that suggests that LGBT populations tend to have more base knowledge about this and tend to be more aligned with the kind of aims of intersex activist groups as well. So there are lots of good reasons to do it, and there are lots of really good reasons to be wary of it not being done well.
So again, I mean, these questions are all kind of, they're coming in thick and fast. We might not be able to, we're literally at time, so perhaps I'll just quickly have another look, because they've started to come, as we anticipated, quite in number just at the end of the talk. Yeah. So there's a question around whether intersex is actually a socially constructed term, even within medicine.
I mean, yes. I would say, okay, I don't know. Coming from a social constructionist kind of background, I would say all of them are, and doing history shows that, and looking through the archive shows you that a particular diagnosis at a particular time or a particular variation emerges at a particular time, is defined in a particular way, shifts and changes over time. So yeah, we need to look at how they're constructed, why and when, all that kind of stuff.
So there are many questions, and David, you're going to be spending some time, I think, answering these in detail and sharing afterwards. So I've just got a few closing comments, but thank you so much for the presentation, David.
Thank you.
It's kind of very interesting hearing about the archives as well as contemporary thought around the issues that you've raised. I just need to kind of mention that again, that we will circulate the questions afterwards. If you visit us to this seminar, please look out for the details of our next seminar on the 22nd of July, which will be a panel discussion on Nothing About Us Without Us, featuring artist Dolly Sen and Chris Samuel, as well as historian Professor David Turner. And they will be discussing their experiences of researching the suppressed histories of disability and Wellcome Collection. So goodbye from Wellcome Collection, and thank you once again to David.